Thank you for joining us today. I am also a UW alum, so I'm excited to be back in that territory.
So when I first saw this book, Creating Compassionate Kids, Essential Conversations, my impression was that it was a book for parents with young children. Is that the audience, or what's your intended audience for the book?
So my intended audience is, like you said, parents, but I define parents very broadly. There are a lot of people who are serving a parenting role in the lives of young children. We have parents who are biological parents, foster parents, step-parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles. Sometimes it's neighbors, community members, early childhood teachers, or other caregivers, really anybody with young children in their lives.
And there is some emphasis on young children and kids, but what about teenagers and older kids? Does it apply to them at all?
I think that a lot of the foundation of what we do with our young children forms the foundation for those relationships that we have with older kids and with teens. And so often the same things that we struggle with our younger children. How do we have conversations about tough topics? How do we help them manage their tough emotions? This is something that doesn't go away as children get older. So there are some things in the book that are very specific to young children. We make storybook recommendations for how to talk about some of these topics that really are targeted for those picture books and those younger ages, but a lot of the messages lay that foundation that should be true throughout childhood and into the teen years.
One other broad question about the book. Now, there have been a lot of parenting books, and some of them give perhaps questionable advice that sometimes doesn't seem so good in retrospect. How do we know we can trust your book here?
That's a great question and an important question to ask, especially because we know how easy it is to get information. And how many of you are parents, can I ask? Okay, so the vast majority in the room. And whether you're a parent now or plan to be a parent or have a young child in your life or an older child in your life in another way, we are inundated with information on what it means to be a parent, what parenting looks like, what parenting should look like, and sometimes that information is very, very conflicting. I teach a parenting class at Oregon State University, and one of the activities we do is we pick topics like immunizations or some of these other challenging topics that might have conflicting viewpoints represented on the internet or in other sources, and look at where do you find that information. And what you find is that you'll find information on all sides of an argument. And so that's a great question to ask about a parenting book, because the same is true. There are a lot of parenting books out, and many of them offer potentially conflicting advice, or sometimes advice that's not really grounded in research. So one of the beliefs that I have is that you should be very transparent about where your information comes from. And so I try to be really open in the book itself about both my personal experiences, which are blended into what I talk about. I've been an early childhood educator. I've been a parenting educator and trained in those best practices for how we teach children about emotions, how we teach them to talk about these tough topics. And quite frankly, there's a lot that we know in child development about how children grow, develop, and thrive. But as parents, it's not so easy to take that information that's in the textbooks that are available and actually turn that into parenting practices and deal with the challenges that we might have every day with our young children. And so in coming to this, having been in the field, having heard thousands of conversations with children and parents around the country, and seen what parents really struggle with, what I've tried to do is take the research we know about, okay, what is it that helps children thrive, and put it into practice, but also blend that with those personal stories. So I try to be as clear as possible of where that's happening so that the reader has a chance to take that information in yourself. I never say, in this book we go through and talk about different examples of challenging conversations to have with young children. And I'll never say there's one right way to talk about this topic. Here are some examples. Here's what we know in research, and let's add this to your parenting toolbox so you can make a choice.
And I really like how after the conversations you go through and you go, these are the key things that we're trying to do in this conversation.
Yeah.
So you can take away that and kind of adapt the conversation to your style somewhat.
Absolutely.
And I think you did a great job of explaining it. And I know in the About section about you, it says that you blend practical experience with research to develop and test programs aimed at promoting social emotional skills for children and adults. And I felt like that kind of captured a little bit of what you were doing in the book, where you kind of talk about some of the practical side, and you mentioned the references to various bits of research throughout. One of the first things you cover in the book was, you said there's the most important conversation you can have with your child. What is that?
Well, one of the most important conversations you can really have is about loving and accepting your child for who they are. That's absolutely foundational to building trust, to let your child that you're not always going to love everything they do. You're not always going to be behind every choice that they make, but you'll always be there for them as a person. And that's moving toward that acceptance of who they are without shaming them for being that person. So really looking at how do we love and accept our children for who they are and help them understand not only who they are now, but who they will grow into and who they will become. As we also then help guide them through some of these challenges, because we don't always like what our children do. We don't always like or support the decisions they make, but that doesn't mean that we won't be there for them to come back to us and feel like they have that trust to know that we'll be there no matter what.
Yeah, and I hear you mentioning trust a lot right now, and I feel like that's a theme that you hit on throughout the book. Why is that so important, the trust with your child and so on?
Well, as I mentioned, having that trust is so foundational to relationships in early childhood and beyond. When children feel like they can trust the parents and the caregivers in their lives to be there for them, they're more likely to turn to them when challenges come up. They want to be like them. They want to learn from them. It's easier to teach and guide them along the way. We also know that when children experience stress, which we all do, we all experience stress, and so often as a parent, we want to shield our child from stress. We want to keep them kids as long as possible, and we want to help them avoid stressful situations. But the reality is, they're going to experience stress, and they're going to experience challenges, and knowing that we will be there to help them through that can have serious implications. We're seeing in research that children who have trusting relationships with adults in their lives who can help them through stress can actually minimize the impact of that stress long term.
And how do the conversations that we have with our kids help to build that trust? What types of things do we do, or even not do, or maybe undermine it? You can touch on both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things we hear is that children, as I mentioned, as parents, we often want to protect our children from stress. And we want to protect them from things that we're worried they're not ready for yet. There's so much out there in the world that our children are going to face. There are so many things that they might see, that they might overhear, that they might become exposed to on the internet, at school, on the news, whether or not we want them to be exposed to it, that oftentimes when our very young children come to us with these questions of things that they're seeing or hearing, we turn to them and say, well, let's talk about that when you're older. Or, let's wait and talk about that another time. And what we mean is, I want to protect you. I want you to be a child as long as possible. I don't want you to have to worry about that now. What our children might hear is, I can't come to you to talk about this. And that's something that we really want to avoid, is not giving our child that message without meaning to, that we're not going to be the ones who are there to answer those questions for them.
Yeah, and I think related to that, you have a whole chapter in here devoted to heavy topics like death and divorce and so on. And yet this is related for kids and young children. Is this something that we can wait to talk to them about? I think you were talking about this some already.
Yeah. It really depends on our child, the age of our child, who our child is, and what we experience. So often, we talk to our child about what we know. We talk to them about what it is we're experiencing, what it is we know that they're seeing. And if you don't mind me stepping back a moment, just in setting this up, when I have had the opportunity to really live in different places in the country and to hear the different kinds of conversations that children and adults have in different settings. And one of the things that I've seen is that most parents talk to children about how much they love them, their hopes and their dreams for them, what they want for them. But there are also a lot of differences in the kinds of conversations that parents and children have, and that varies by context. And there are some children who never grow up talking about death or never grow up talking about stress. But on the flip side, there are other families who talk about that all the time. So when I was working with military families, for example, those families were talking about the stress of being deployed or separated from a loved one for a long period of time, and the possible death or the reality of having a death in the family as a result. When I was working in inner city urban areas, there were families there who talked every day about how the impact of the color of their child's skin would affect how they were being looked at, the opportunities that they had, or the reason that people would cross the street to avoid standing next to them. And yet, these were the kinds of conversations that other families weren't having. And often when I think about this and whether or not we should tackle some of these tough conversations, what I'm reminded of is that some of these topics define a young child's life every single day. There are parents who don't have a choice, who have to tackle these tough topics because they define their child's life, how their child is looked at, the opportunities that their child has. And it was having that experience to see all of these different experiences that children and families had that really got me thinking about this book and to think about how do I as a parent use this opportunity that I've had to see and peer into the lives of all of these children and families, and to think about for my own child and then the children that I work with, how do we help them be more compassionate? How do we help them get those skills to prepare for what they might face in their lives, but also to be more understanding of what other children might be experiencing around our country and around the world? And so in a not so small nutshell, that's one of my arguments for why we should talk about these topics. When our children want to learn from us, this is a chance to help them learn about the world, about others' experiences, to be more compassionate to that, but then also to talk about skills that they might need when they face those challenges or if they face those challenges in the future.
So given, let's say we buy this, that we should have that conversation, what are some strategies that we can use to have these types of conversations?
Sure. So in the book, I break down the sections into different types of conversations. And one set of conversations is really about emotions and how we help children manage those tough emotions. And I think that each of these, as I'll just briefly touch on, these different sections and types of conversations we have different strategies that go along with them. And so one of the starting sections that I talk about in the book is how we set up that relationship with our children, really listening to them and giving them a chance to share, giving them a chance to listen, and that back and forth that goes on between parents or other adults and the children in their lives. In that first section, where we talk about some of these strategies for how do we do this when our children have those really tough emotions, that's one of the questions that I think I'm asked most often about parents, is how do we talk to children about those really hard, challenging emotions? And it's such a big challenge for a lot of different reasons. So if you think about, I'm going to turn things on you for just a moment. Those of you who have children, most folks in the room, what are the skills that a new baby has to communicate or to have a conversation? How do they let us know when they need something? Okay, just heard the universal word, cry. What else? What else do they do?
Fidget.
Fidget, okay. Yeah, move your body. Yeah, move around. Tense, get tense, kick, scream. We hope, sometimes smile. Laugh at some point. We hope for those moments too. But when our children are born, they are essentially programmed to be a ball of impulses and instincts, to use their bodies and their cries to let us know that they need something. Now, when we're talking about how do we have conversations with young children who are kicking and screaming and they can't talk back with us, or they get a little bit older and all they want to do is run around with a diaper on their head, we have to get really creative. First, we can let them know that we're recognizing those emotions as the way that they're expressing themselves. And as parents, oftentimes it's our goal to help children move from being that child who's kicking and screaming and tensing and sometimes smiling to being able to say, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, Or I'm kind of grumpy. Can you help me calm down? How many of you know adults who can do that? Maybe not as many as we'd like. And so in recognizing that our children's emotions are actually, the way that they express them, are a way of communicating a need, and then talking about that, labeling it, being able to use words ourselves, and to be a role model in the way that we talk about our own emotions to help them learn to do that. And in showing our children, they can trust us to talk about their emotions really in a teaching kind of way, rather than a punishing way. We can also help set that stage for these other conversations. So for thinking about how we go about tackling these more complex topics as our children are ready.
So you mentioned emotions and handling them, and some adults have trouble with that. So what do we do? We're even having trouble with managing our emotions. How can we teach the skills to our kids?
That's a great question, because as adults, this isn't something that we're always taught ourselves either, in terms of, okay, when we get really frustrated, that impulse of that kicking and that screaming toddler still lives within us sometimes. And to really be able to step back and say, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, what's going on? This is a great chance to practice thinking about, okay, what is it I want my child to do when they're having this feeling? What's our family emotion rule for frustration or anger or stress? Our children have these feelings. How can we teach them to show it in a way that's effective and appropriate? And then coming back to ourselves to think about, well, let's talk about this. What does this look like? And now I should be practicing this too as a parent. So if this is our family emotion rule, if our rule is that we're going to try our hardest to not kick and throw and scream, but to stop and say, I'm angry, I've got to try that too. And when I don't, then think about, all right, when my child can't do this either, what do I want them to do? To step back and say, I should have done something differently. And a child will never do that, or a teenager. Imagine them coming in and saying, you know, last night when you wouldn't let me take the car out, I got so mad and I just started yelling. Dad, I shouldn't have done that. Next time I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to come to you and tell you how I'm feeling. Can you imagine a teenager doing that? They won't unless we do that and model it for them first. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's worth it.
So we're going to keep asking questions,
Sure.
But I also want to invite, if any of you have questions about conversations with your kids, feel free to come to the mic and we'll start to mix those in. Anyway, and if not, we'll just keep going up here and you can listen to the two of us talking. So when I read this, I read it pretty much straight through, given the timing and all. And I almost felt overwhelmed by the amount of information here and trying to think about it all. How would you recommend that people can kind of absorb it and apply it best?
That's a great question. There's a lot of information in this book, and it's divided up, as I mentioned, into different sections that tackle different kinds of conversations. So one section is on those foundational conversations about letting our children know that they can trust us, that we love them, that we're going to manage their emotions in a way that's teaching and guiding rather than punitive. Another section on self-awareness and acceptance, and really helping children learn about the qualities that will make them who they are, to those qualities that make others who they are. And those conversations include topics like sex, gender, gender identity, race, culture, different types of families. And then moving into another section on conversations that focus on tough topics, like you mentioned, Dave, divorce, death, suicide, guns, stress, sex, some of these challenging topics that come up over time, and sometimes earlier than we expect with our children. And then the final section is on these conversations that help us think about all that we've been learning and applying that to friendships, to relationships inside and outside of the family, to recognizing privilege, to really thinking about how do we find our voice and make a difference. And along with that come very specific and concrete ideas. So storybook recommendations with discussion questions, family activities, parenting Q&As. With all of that being packed into one book, I really encourage folks to pick it up and take a look at what's helpful at different times. It's the kind of book that you can read straight through, but you also, it may be hard to go through and really think about, now how do I apply this at home if you're not taking it little by little? So it's the kind of book that's meant to be taken in snippets if it's helpful.
Yeah, really, I guess I like two things about that. One, I like the index and back. So if you're having some struggle with some topic or whatever, you can look back there and see if it's covered. And
Absolutely.
two, like you mentioned, at the end of the chapters, there's the book recommendations. How do those tie in and help with you understanding or working through the topics better?
So storybooks are a great way to tackle topics that we might not otherwise feel prepared to talk about with our children. It can be a great way to also take a look at challenges like challenging emotions, anger or frustration outside of those emotionally charged moments. If our children are in the middle of a tantrum, that's not always the best time to say, oh, I can see you're really frustrated. Let's talk about what you should do instead. They're going to keep on tantruming and kicking and screaming. They are emotionally charged. They are in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Not so much freeze, more of that fight mode. And they're not listening. They're not learning. But we can use books to pull out of that situation and say, okay, oh, look what made this character feel really angry or frustrated or disappointed. Have you ever felt that way? What do we do when we feel that way? So that's one way. Another way that I think books and storybooks are so important is it's a way to build empathy, to learn about others' experiences, to be able to bring in role models to your child's life of people who look like they do, who think like they do, dress like they do, have a family that looks like theirs. And that's harder to do for children who come from a non-dominant culture or who have a non-dominant family type. We have to really work hard to make sure our children have role models who look like they do, so that they feel valued, so that they feel like part of a community. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is I think it's important for children who come from dominant groups and dominant cultures also to have those role models from minority and non-dominant groups so that those children see one another as part of that same community too. So I've tried really hard in this book to come up with a wide range of storybook recommendations that really depict children and families in different situations, experiencing different challenges and strengths, so that we can have those role models for our children.
Sounds great. I think we have a question.
Sure.
So my question's around kind of like the age range. I'm sure the skill sets and the methods that you talk about in your book apply to children throughout their lives, but would you say that there is a cutoff or an age range where these conversations become really crucial or have like a lasting impact on kind of, I guess, how compassionate children become?
That's a great question. I think that just to tackle age range, the book I would say is ideal in the 0 to 8 or 9 age range is where I'd put it in terms of where the conversation examples are coming from, as well as where the storybooks are the best fit. But I think it's also never too late. You know, it's never too late to have a conversation or to build a relationship with your child where you can help them practice these skills. We've got to look at compassion like a skill or a set of skills, just like anything else. Just like emotion regulation, just like anything that we're learning and practicing. And it may be harder later on if children haven't had a lot of practice. But again, it's never too late. I once had a parent sitting in a workshop with me who said, so I've got teenage boys at home, and the stuff you're talking about emotions and how we talk about it, I want to do that now. So what do? Do I just go home and say, this is how we roll now? And we're just going to talk about emotions from now on? And it was a real question that he was asking because he hadn't been doing this at home. And he said, well, what do I do if I now see the value in this and I just want to change things? And a big part of that is putting yourself up as a role model. And so coming home and opening yourself up and saying, okay, I had a tough day at work today and I kind of want to talk about this. Did anyone else have these kinds of feelings too? What do you think I should do about this? So I hope that answers your question.
And we'll go to another question, but I think one thing that I got out of it is that it's really good that you start from a very young age, even before your children are nonverbal and so on, to start to have these conversations. And that I think you're emphasizing that's where the trust comes from and so on, just continuing throughout.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Hi, what are your thoughts about conversation with children about their relationship with technology so that they are in control and use tech as their tools to achieve their goals? Because otherwise, like a parent that stands in the way between a child and a screen can cause strong emotions in a child. I think that's a side that can be often found.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think technology is such a big part of our lives and such a big part of our children's lives, and even more so for them now than it was for us growing up. And society is continuing to move in that direction. And I touch a little bit on technology. I don't have it as a specific topic in the book. I mention it a little bit here and there, but I think that, like with anything else, we have to be a role model in looking at how do we be a good citizen in using technology? What are all of the strengths that technology brings to our lives? What are the capacities that it brings? What are all of those tools that can really enhance what we're doing, our effectiveness, our efficiency, but then also looking at what are some of the challenges. So some of the ways that technology is coming out as problematic is in cyberbullying, or in some of the ways that children are relating to each other outside of those personal moments. Sometimes we interact with one another in a different way when it comes out over technology. And I really try to think about, in my own life too as a parent, modeling what we want to see in our children. So thinking about if we want our children to set limits around the time or the way that they're using technology, we have to model that too. We have to talk about it, share those family values around it. What are our rules with that? And then also thinking about how do we engage our children in that technology in a really healthy way. So one of the things that, for me as a parent, for example, that I know many of you as parents probably think about this too, when it's the first day of school, what do I want to do? Take a picture and put it up on social media. My daughter has not wanted me to take a picture and put it on social media for the last 3 years. So since she was in kindergarten, I have not posted a first day of school picture as much as I've wanted to. And that's hard as a parent because I think, well, this is my life too, but it's also hers to decide how she's shown and how she's depicted. And that I've seen as just one little lesson in terms of saying, okay, so you've got to remember, I will always do this for you. If you don't want to be shown on social media, I won't put your picture there. Just like how you should treat other people in the way that you talk to people or talk about people, or whether or not you post a picture or take something down when you're asked. We have to learn how to treat people respectfully across these platforms while also valuing all of the amazing capacity that technology brings. Yeah. Thank you.
And I think you touched on a little bit there, but part of your book you talk about, I think, respecting the boundaries of kids too, when they're talking about things like, oh, go give that uncle a hug or whatever, and they're like, I don't want to. And how do you deal with this type of situation?
Sure. Well, and I think it does relate to technology, and it relates to a lot of areas what you're talking about too, is in relation to your body and who has control over what you do. And as we are raising our children, one of the reasons that I think having these kinds of conversations is so important and tackling tough conversation topics is so important is that it gives us a chance to help our children build skills to think about what do you want and what do you not want, and how do you speak up when you need something or don't want something, but then also showing them that we will follow through with that. You know, for a child to say, I don't want to hug that person, it's pretty common to say, no, go and hug your grandparents, or go hug your uncle, or go hug your aunt. But then we're telling our child that they don't have control over their body. And if we really want them to believe that they do, we've got to listen to that too. And I think part of this, in having those tough conversations into other topics as well, is learning that over time, we have to give more and more trust to our child in terms of them being able to make those decisions for themselves and them having the skills that they need to manage conversations or tough situations that'll come up, because we won't always be there.
But is there a possibility of giving them too much choice and too much leeway, and I don't know, you kind of like let them rule the whole thing? Or
Absolutely. I think boundaries are also very important. You know, we can't say to a child, I'll listen to what you need in terms of technology, and they say, okay, well, I'd like to watch shows for 5 hours on this device or that device. We also set boundaries, and I think as parents, we also need to communicate our family values, whether it is technology or whether or not whose choices it is related to your own body or anything else. One of the things, just to give an example in the book, and talking about sex, which is a challenging topic for many families, teens, there's been some research showing that teens actually wish that their parents talked more to them about family values around sex, where they're getting a lot of talks around safe sex practices, but not about necessarily about those family values. That's not always the case, but that has to be a piece of this too.
We have another question.
Yeah.
Hi, my wife and I come from a different country, and we have different experiences growing up. Our kids, grow up here. They have a much more comfortable lifestyle. I feel like, in general, at least I think so. So one of the difficult topics usually arise when there is a sense of entitlement. At least my wife and I feel like, when we were growing up, we didn't have this or that. So and you kind of talked about it earlier about, storybooks. Do you have any other techniques to kind of show them, hey, you know what, maybe try to have to get a better perspective on their situation as far as, like growing up here versus where we grew up from? Do you have any other tools aside from like storybooks, any other techniques?
Yeah, well, one that you were talking about too is sharing your personal stories, sharing what it was like growing up. My mom is an immigrant; she's from Taiwan.
But it tends to be like, she keeps saying that again, that story again.
But also to say, this is really important for me to share with you because this is what it was like when I was growing up. This is what it's like here, and I think that even in passing throughout the day, at holiday time, sometimes when it seems like there's so much and so much more than maybe others are experiencing, to be able to talk about that we are very fortunate here, and pointing out those things that we're really grateful for, talking about gratitude, what it is we're thankful for, because others don't always have these things, and these are things in our lives that we really appreciate. But it's hard sometimes when you're fighting against the excitement of new things or having more with young children to have those conversations. But I think it's important to continually, in a way that both allows them to be kids and celebrate what they want to celebrate, have that continual reminder of this is something we should be thankful for. Writing thank you notes, talking about gratitude, why we're grateful for things, and also, I'll go back to that example of storybooks, but I think it is important to show what other children experience and how that's similar to and different from your own lives to build that empathy and that understanding as well. Yeah, thank you.
So you talked a little bit in these various things about being an example and all. Yeah. And so if we want to teach our kids compassion, is just being nice to other people just good enough?
It's a start. It's a good start. And it's amazing to see how much or how little children pick up on. If you're standing, one of the examples I used in the book, just a simple example, was holding the door open for somebody else. If you hold the door open for somebody else, and your child's standing there right next to you, so you think, they are seeing me stand here and being a good role model. Your child may be thinking, why are you taking so long? I want to get home, or I want to go to school, if you don't talk about it. And so speaking those words and what's going on in your head out loud in terms of holding the door open and saying, I'm going to hold the door open because I see this person coming who's holding a lot of bags in their arms, and it looks really heavy. So I'm going to hold the door open because I'd like to be helpful for them. And I think that what they're doing looks really hard. You start speaking that inside voice out loud. It's something that makes other adults crazy in terms of, let me move the chair for you because I see that you were coming back this way and you weren't quite far enough, and so I wanted to. It makes other adults crazy. But it's really good for kids to hear that language. And the same thing goes for the previous question that we just had in terms of saying out loud, I think I'm only going to do this, or I'm only going to take this much, or I'm not going to buy anything new because I feel like we have enough. Expressing that out loud, those words out loud, not only helps children see those examples of compassion a little bit more, but it teaches them how to think. It teaches them how to stop and think about somebody else's feelings first. Yeah.
We have another question.
Hi. So I have teenagers, teenage girls at home, and very 2 years apart. They're 2 years apart, and outside they are nice, they're the best girls. And with my family, it's always perfect. But at home, between each other, it's a very different story. And I'm not going to repeat some of the things that they call each other. And I make sure that they understand, okay, this is what happened at home, and I'm not going to say, don't say that to your sister, it's not appropriate. And they also acknowledge that, no, they're not using these words or this behavior outside, they understand that. My hope is that it's going to continue, right? It's going to be true at home and true outside as well. Yeah. Any recommendation on how to deal with kind of this situation?
One, I think celebrating what's happening outside the home in terms of everyone's doing well, and by all appearances outside, folks are like, oh, they've got it all together. And I think that happens so often in families too, especially with young children. Has anyone had that experience where home just feels like it's falling apart and a mess, and then folks say, your child is so sweet and doing so well and so kind, and you think, really? Thank goodness. And some of that is that it's hard. It's a lot of work to really manage your emotions, to manage your behaviors, to keep a check on what you're saying all the time is hard to do. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of intensity. It takes a lot of brain power for our children. And so knowing that by the time they come home that they're exhausted, they may be just done, the fact is they can do it. And you're seeing it happen outside of the home, so you know it's there. So one, celebrate that. So that's great. And two, recognize that, yeah, I think that that's probably true across many families, that we don't always treat each other within our families as compassionately as we treat people outside of our families. And that hopefully that'll grow and change as you continue to have those conversations about what we do, what we don't do, what we value as a family. And opening up some of those conversations about, how was your day? What are you thinking about now? Helping them connect when they can in different ways. I know that wasn't a really specific answer, but I'd be happy to talk more afterward too. Thank you.
I know in my family I have 2 kids that, anyway, I can relate. But I remember reading something in your book, and you were talking about how you had a situation with 2 kids that were kind of arguing and so on. And I know my tendency at times has been to kind of jump in and solve things, like jump right in and kind of like. But I think in your book you had a different type of scenario going. Can you tell us more about that? Yeah.
Sure. I think there has to be a blend and a balance. And just like with anything else, we want to make sure our children have the skills they need to navigate different situations. And so in navigating sibling rivalry, do we jump in right away and say, okay, I told you not to do that. You go to your room. You go to your room. Let's just break it up. Versus helping them figure out how to problem solve and how to come together and say, wait a minute, what happened? Let's talk through this. And when children are younger, being there to guide them through what happened. Why don't you tell me what happened? Why don't you tell me what happened? How are you feeling about this? How are they feeling about this? To really get children to focus on one another's feelings and to think about one another's situations, which can be really hard in those sibling conflict moments. And so looking at how do we build their relationship so that they're really thinking about one another's feelings inside and outside these conflict moments. And it's one of these things that we scaffold over time, where we play more of a role early on, again, trying to avoid some of the, well, let's just stop the scenario and get out of this because I can't deal with this anymore. And that'll happen sometimes because we'll be too tired to do anything else, and that's okay. But if we can also add in these, okay, let's talk through this, scaffolding that so our children start learning those skills so that they can learn to do that on their own.
So you mentioned this a little bit in the when we were talking about bullying, kind of touching on it somewhat. But how can we teach our children to stand up for themselves and others when they're hitting those types of scenarios?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that's starting to get a lot more attention now with conversations about how do we help children be upstanders rather than bystanders, or different terms are being used. And one of the ways comes back to that foundation of when we show our children that we are listening to them. We are taking their feelings and their words seriously. They learn that adults will do that for them. And not all children have that in their lives. And so if repeatedly they've been shown that regardless of the feelings they've had or the words they've shared, no one's listened, they're probably less likely to be able to stand up in those situations. And so if we've really built this foundation to show children that we take them seriously and we're here to listen to them, they're more likely in those moments to be able to do that. But then we also have to help them prepare for it. So if you think about a situation that might be challenging for a child, if you're seeing an instance of bullying for the first time, or somebody getting hurt, or somebody being treated unfairly, if you've never thought about that before, but all of a sudden you see it and you think, oh, that doesn't feel good, I don't like that. If we've had those conversations, let's say we've read storybooks, or we've played with dolls or role-played different scenarios that might be challenging, or even talked about different movies that we've watched together, or TV shows, and talked about what would you do in that moment? We can help our children learn scripts that they can say. We can help them learn and practice saying, hey, cut that out. Or help them learn and think about, well, I don't feel good, I wouldn't feel good standing up and saying that, but I would feel okay going and telling a teacher, or going in and asking an adult for help. So if we help our children outside of those moments think about what they would do in those moments, they're more likely to see it through.
So we're getting close to the end of our time, so I'll ask you some general questions.
Yeah.
Do you have any other advice for parents?
Sure. Let's see. A big
Book
question.
two.
A big question. But I think parenting is hard. Parenting is hard work. I think there's a lot of belief that's really prevalent that you should just know what to do as a parent. And so when you seek out support or parenting education, there's a lot of stigma that's still pervasive in our society about doing that. That that's only for bad parents or those parents who don't know what they're doing, rather than acknowledging that this is learned. We are trying our hardest along the way, and parenting is a challenge regardless of your background, regardless of your education level. Parenting some children is harder than others, depending on your own personality, their personalities, and their needs as well, and the context that you live in. And so one of the pieces of advice I have is to be more compassionate to one another. So often we're fearful of being judged when we're standing in line at the grocery store and our child is melting down. Or we're in the parking lot just trying to get in the car and we're looking around hoping that nobody else sees us. And so to think about what can we do in those moments to be a support for one another, to see each other as learners, just as we're trying to help our children see themselves, and to be there for one another.
I guess my last question, and maybe the last question if nobody else comes up, but is there anything else you'd like readers to know about your book, Creating Compassionate Kids, or in general, Creating Compassionate Kids?
Sure. Oh gosh. Let me think for a moment in terms of anything that we haven't shared yet. I think that, as we said, it's never too late. Parenting is hard, and acknowledging that the more you know, the more tools you have in your parenting toolbox. And so I really just appreciate you being here, to learn, to share. I'd be more than happy to answer or chat about specific questions.
And I don't get in the last question.
Sure, absolutely.
So I'm probably going to have white kids. You talked about, in some situations, it's more important to, some families you end up having more conversations about like what life is like growing up. How people are going to perceive you based on the color of your skin. Like maybe you're going to have more death in your family because you're a thing. What are your recommendations for having those conversations from a more privileged standpoint without instilling a sense of intrinsic guilt for having that privilege?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have a whole section in the book on, as I mentioned, self-awareness. And I think that one of the things that we can do for our children is not just talk about the qualities that make them who they are. My daughter is also very fair-skinned. She has blue eyes despite the other dark eyes in our family. And she will, in our country, probably never be discriminated against because of the color of her skin. And so thinking about how do we, with children of all races, talk about race and with honesty in terms of how challenging and how race is seen in our society. So often we want to teach children that differences don't matter. But the truth is they do. There are some children growing up recognizing and living the fact that their differences do matter in the way that people look at them, treat them, the opportunities that they have. And I think that if we have conversations with all of our children about race, about sexual orientation, about gender identity, about different cultures, different religions, we can help our children think about the impact of that in their own life and help them feel comfortable emerging into who they're growing up to be, but also help them to see both the challenges and the strengths that other people have. Because we really want them to see that as a strength, and that diversity as a strength, rather than a difference to be afraid of. So, yeah.
And last question.
Okay.
Pressure.
Sure.
We're not originally from the U.S. I'm from Israel, so we're Jewish, turns out. And we walk around with our kids, and there's these, you pose with Santa and all these things. And my daughter says, "Let's stand on this line." I explained to her, "No, it's okay. We don't stand on this line because we don't celebrate Christmas. Why? Because we do Hanukkah, whatever." Mm-hmm. The problem happens when she goes back to school, yep. And we send her to, we don't send her to a Jewish school because we feel she should be with everyone. Yep. Basically, so one of her friends says something like, "Hey, I got my picture, with Santa," and my daughter goes, "We don't celebrate Christmas." And my instinct is to try to explain to her, that's not what you say. I mean, it's okay for other people to have how do I get around that while, on one hand, trying to maintain our, I don't know if it's values or beliefs, but on the other hand, still making sure that she respects everyone else's, even, because she's not getting a bad example, but she's perceiving it that way. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. One, all of the other parents in the classroom, in my opinion, should be thinking about how they talk to their children about other cultures, about people celebrating in other ways, having other holidays, other religions. And because then, when another child says, "Oh, you don't celebrate Christmas, what do you celebrate instead?" And seeing that as something to be interested in and wanting to learn about, and seeing that as part of, in our community, we all have different ways of thinking about things, of sharing, of coming together in our family, with our culture. And so one piece of that question, which you don't have control over, and then the other in terms of the way that you approach your daughter, it's okay. And it's okay for her to say, "We don't celebrate Christmas. Here's what we celebrate instead." Or "Here's what's important in my family." And I think too often it's folks who, in your case, in the community that you're living in, come from the minority group. Too often it falls on your shoulders to be the one to explain, to educate, or even defend your family to others because of that lack of awareness or the lack of those conversations. And that's one of the things that I really am striving to help change. But I think what you're doing with your daughter, it's a challenge in terms of thinking about how do we help her then be that role model of recognizing where our family fits in to this other more dominant society around them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you very much for coming and talking about your book and ways that we can create compassionate kids.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.